Welcome to the Procurement Software Podcast, where we aim to educate and inspire you about how technology is changing and shaping our profession. The truth is, there's never been a more exciting time to be in procurement, but only if you're one of those organizations that's embracing the change and driving new developments. And this podcast is all about giving you the tools to help you get there. So buckle up and let's get right into this week's show. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Procurement Software Podcast. And my guest today is Rujul Zaparde, founder and CEO of Zip. And if you haven't heard of Zip, then I think you've been hiding under a rock, because these guys are really making waves with their intake platform. So Rujul, just give a quick intro, and then I will start off by asking you a classic intro question, which is, you've just been appointed head of procurement and the CFO has given you a $50,000 budget to spend on driving modernization and digitization of your function. What would you spend it on? So introduce yourself, and then I'm going to throw you straight in with that question.
No, James, thank you so much for having me, and very excited to be here today. I'm Rujul, co-founder and CEO here at Zip, and that's a great question. That's a great way to start. I think that's actually a dynamic that I think we see fairly often, right? Lots of new procurement teams, especially with the macro climate that I think we've all been in these last 2 years or so. Procurement and control and visibility over spend have just become so front and center in this environment. And so, starting a new procurement function from scratch is certainly something that comes up. The way I would answer it is, I think ultimately everything starts at the point of origination. And so if you have visibility as a procurement leader into where your demand is in the organization, right? Like the minute somebody's like, oh, I might need to do business with a new supplier, or, oh, I have a problem, I think I might need a new supplier to help solve that for me. Like the earlier you can get involved, the more leverage you have, because you can redirect to an existing supplier that this person just has no idea we already have, that we do business with. It could be, okay, this is actually a huge project. We should probably get at least a couple of suppliers to look at this and sort of compete, right? And so it always starts at the point of origination. And for us, that's intake, that one front door experience with no training required. Because if you have to train somebody to use software in 2023, you sort of already lost the battle before the war before the battle has begun. And so, my view of all this is starting with intake and starting with the point of origination. Because if you have control and visibility over everything that's occurring at the earliest point in time, you can then figure out what to do with it. And you even know how much demand you have versus finding out much later in the process.
Yeah, 100%. So it's really what you're saying then, if I can paraphrase you, is it's all about early involvement, whether that means getting a better deal or just avoiding or bringing under the umbrella a lot of what would otherwise have been break spend, essentially.
Exactly. Or not even just necessarily maverick spend, even spend that, almost gets sort of brought up and you get visibility when someone has a contract. Because if they're holding an MSA from a vendor, that vendor thinks that probably going to win that business. So it is harder for you to negotiate, even if you are actually going to proceed. Or it's hard to kill it because now this person is evaluated for 2 months and they're really emotionally attached to buying this thing from this party. And you can unwind it, but that's hard. I mean, that costs you, not money, but it costs you something internally or someone in leadership, for them to do that. And so, it's not even just maverick spend. It might even be regular spend, just getting involved earlier.
So the first time I came across you guys I was on a webinar with Felix back in probably around April, May 2021. And you were very new in this space and you've kind of created this whole intake category as a result of your product. You've moved now from being an intake solution to what you now describe as intake to pay. And what I'm really curious about is that you could have taken this in so many different functions. So I'm just curious to know what convinced you to go down that specific route.
No, that's a great question. We created this category around intake orchestration. Another way to sort of frame it is, I think I've heard Intake-to-Procure, which is sort of that upstream, process from the traditional procure to pay. And what I will say is that, we are and always will be an intake company because that's the thing that, makes us special in the world. And that's the thing that we have the significant majority of our 100-person, engineering development team dedicated to. But truth be told, if, when we had started the company, you were like, hey, when are you going to, build the downstream, the procure to pay side? I would have been like, oh, it would maybe many years from now. But what happened was we had so many customers that were, actually really happy with the intake experience. And they were like, well, starts in Zip, our entire employee base, 5,000 employees. I'm making up an example. Like they all know that they need to go to Zip to kick off a request. All of the approvals and all the different teams, legal, security, IT, are used to it. And they're, maybe reviewing in Zip as well. And so why can't you all just do the back end of it? Like, why can't you all just house the purchase order and do the invoice processing and that stuff? And we sort of felt, okay, like, let's pull that forward because that came up so many times with so many customers because we have earned their trust with our core product. And so we ended up, this was about 2 years ago now, also building a procure to pay product. And so we do intake to procure to pay for companies that want it. But I would say 9.5 times out of still start with intake. And that's the place, like that's the change that's occurred in the world that, that sort of precipitated this need for a new category that, that I think we ultimately created. The other thing, to kind of point out is like, I actually think to like do intake really well, it's really, really hard. And I say that because, we have banks, for example, that might have 17 different types of risk teams reviewing spend. We have healthcare companies or healthcare systems that have totally different sets of people, teams, with HIPAA and other regulations. We, of course, have tech companies. We have large enterprises that have like their own sort of set of flows. And so like that flexibility and the ability to sort of configure no code while also maintaining, nearly 100 different types of permissioning controls and permission groups. And like that level of flexibility and complexity is actually much, much greater, is what I've found from an engineering and product and design burden sort of perspective. Like it's much harder to get that to work and build that really, really well than actually the more traditional downstream procure to pay, which might be counterintuitive. But anyways, that's the other point.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought that either. But yeah, I've never built any procurement tech, so who would I be to know? I actually got to see a demo of your products when I was at DPW in October. And one of the things that strikes anyone that would see a demo of your products is just how smooth the UX, the user experience is. And I know that, based on your founding team, you've come from a lot of these really successful B2C tech companies where UX is king. Do you think procurement even realizes that they have a UX problem with some of the legacy tech that's still being used?
I honestly think that I've actually been so, I remember when we started the company too, I was actually so pleasantly surprised because I actually think people totally realize that, hey, there's a usability problem here. And there's nothing wrong with that system, maybe. Like it's a great system of record. It's still where we store, our POs or, whatever, contracts, whatever downstream data. But the system of engagement was lacking. And then the price that you pay for that, if you will, is that, well, then it's not intuitive. So then they don't like either know what to do or they don't do it until it's later, right? It's like, oh, the right path is just so complicated. Like, what's human nature? Human nature is I'll just do that later. And so what happens is then you can't be strategic because you're not looped in earlier. And so you have that's like the price that you pay, for not having like great sort of user experience that drives really good, adoption. And yeah, in terms of the way that we look at, and I think about user experience, I used to work at Airbnb before starting Zip, along with my co-founder, Lou. We both worked at Airbnb and, I worked on the search product and the search platform teams at Airbnb. So a lot of, if you go to Airbnb.com, how that search experience works, a lot of components of that. And, what we realized is that, a company like Airbnb has millions of people visiting Airbnb.com every single day. And so whenever we're making a change, right, like we change a button this way, we make it slightly bigger, or we change the way that a filter works. If you're, searching for certain dates for a destination you're going to, we would actually be able to A/B test that and get to statistical significance in the matter of a day to 2 days across 10 million people that are actually searching over those 2 days, for example. So, you do all these little incremental experiments and just keep improving continuously, hundreds of experiments a year, right? Like that's the level of pace. And that's because as a consumer business, you have to earn the right to the business every second of every minute of every hour of every day. Because if you don't, someone's going to close that browser window and go somewhere else, right? And unfortunately, in enterprise software, and certainly, in this space, in financial software more broadly, like you actually only have to earn the right to the business, once every 3 years, maybe even once every 5 years. And you only have to earn that right with like maybe the CFO or the procurement like leadership, right? Like somebody in a position of power internally. But who gets forgotten in all that? Well, it's the end user, the person that just needs their thing. And ultimately, if you actually solve for them, it makes everything else much easier, but they've just been forgotten. And so everyone in procurement and finance, unfortunately, just so used to swimming against the current and against the grain. But if you actually make it easier to adopt and follow the process, suddenly you sort of find like, wait a minute, like the entire current is going the other way. And now it's actually much easier. Like you don't have to fight with the business to like get them to like loop you in or earlier or follow a certain process. Like they just do it, which I think we've pleasantly found is something that people are just kind of shocked by because it's just like they weren't expecting that, like in the most positive way. They're just expecting that there would be some pushback or whatever, but there's not if you solve for the user experience.
I'd like to just break down one of the things that you said in that last answer, because it sort of made me curious. When you were saying that you were doing A/B testing and little tweaks to buttons and features when you were at Airbnb, on a B2B platform like Zip, do you have enough users to be able to get statistically significant data within that short period of time to be able to do that very same thing? Or is it a much longer process and you're happy with that because, as you said, you've got a lot more customer loyalty if someone's typically signing a 3-year contract rather than just clicking away in their browser on one of the consumer-based apps?
Yeah, it's a great question. Statistical significance is certainly harder because they're certainly not, the volume of people that are going in and logging in is obviously much lower. I do think that I don't actually know exactly, but I think we've got, I think close to 1 million users in Zip now across all of our customers. But what I would say is that, what we tried to do is really hire, the absolute best engineers, designers, product managers in the world. We only hired in San Francisco and we have some in New York. And we really ultimately the best designers, work at consumer companies. And so we actually have our entire design team comes from consumer companies. And so they're used to a certain bar of user experience because if you didn't maintain that bar, you wouldn't have a consumer business, the business wouldn't exist. It wouldn't make it. And so, that's why I think in many ways, the demo that you referenced that you saw at DPW, it comes through the product because we're actually building for the consumer use case and mindset. And it's because, ultimately, of course, the end user is a consumer of procurement and a customer of procurement internally to the organization. But anyone that works in procurement too, is also we all use, DoorDash and Uber Eats and, all these other apps as personally as humans and consumers generally in the world. And if I had to use a training manual to figure out how to order food on Uber Eats, Uber Eats wouldn't exist as a business. Somebody else would exist and they would have died by now. So, I think everyone sort of expects a certain level of, usability in software today in a way that they maybe didn't 10 years or certainly 20 years ago. And so, we're just very, very, very focused on that. And the last thing I'll say on that too is that I think a lot of companies in this general space, I think and this is a philosophical thing for me, but they're sales-led companies, right? They'll say they have a product, but the engineers are in India or, in another region or whatever. They're not it's front and center. It's, it's a sales-led company. It's led by sales. And we're not that. That's it. We're a product-led company. Both my co-founder Lou and I, Lou was an engineering leader at Airbnb and I worked in product management. And so neither of us has ever worked at a company that had a sales team. We both have consumer backgrounds. And also neither of us actually worked in procurement or finance or any of these core functions. We were actually end users building products. And so we really, maintain that ethos at Zip and really care about, ultimately we live and die by the product and how happier.
Interesting approach compared to a lot of the legacy software that's out there. And that sort of leads on nicely, going back to you now offering the end-to-end product as intake through to pay. If I challenge you and say, okay, well, a lot of your early users, especially with you being based in San Francisco, a lot of your early users were tech and IT companies, and they're naturally going to be a little bit more forward thinking. And in some stages, maybe were even greenfield if they were rapidly scaling companies and they were implementing their first round of digitization in the procurement space. But now that you've got all of this funding and growth trajectory, how do you then replicate that? And how do you make that very same product applicable to the consumer goods conglomerate in Ohio or the German tier one automotive company or a Swiss bank or insurer? Because they're going to have almost certainly a legacy source to pay, source to contract platform in place, and no CPO or CFO is gonna put their hands on the table and say, okay, we messed up with this. It's sunk cost. We need to put something else in place.
Yeah, no, totally. And just to be clear, like we are not actually trying to replace those systems at companies like that. That's actually not the intent at all. Our intent is just to solve the engagement issue and the adoption issue up front, and to say, hey, you might have this, procure to pay or source to pay stack or system. We just want to help you work on the user experience layer on top and have Intake actually help you get more adoption so you can actually get more use out of that system, which is actually good for you and also good for that, that company, that provider that actually, is that source to pay company. Everybody actually benefits because more spend moves under management. There's earlier visibility into that spend. And really, that's what we're solving for. Just sitting on top, certainly not replacing. And you're right. I mean, as a tech company, who is it easy to sell to early on when you have no customers and no employees? Tech companies, because they also used to have no customers and no employees at some point in time. So, of course, to your point, we started off selling into tech. But what we've seen now across, we have, many hundreds of customers now. And I think what we've seen is that, like, we've sort of moved well past that for a while now and have customers in pretty much every industry from, retail to banking to other financial services and insurance to healthcare to, I can't even think of CPG, manufacturing, all sorts of industries. You mentioned a bank and like we have European banks as customers, for example. And I think what we've seen is that, ultimately the problem that everybody fundamentally has in indirect procurement is actually like kind of like the same thing. And it's like, I struggle with adoption. I struggle with getting people to follow the process early enough that I can drive the maximum amount of leverage for my business, and for my, in my role and capacity. And it's a usability and sort of lacking a front door to the engagement with like, how do I engage procurement that like through software that like is a very clear thing that's easy. Like, how do I do that with that one front door? And then how do I manage all the cross-functional pieces of, cybersecurity, resiliency? Like, how do I manage like what's happening across all these different teams? And now the teams might vary, right? If you're an oil and gas company, it's going to vary than if you're a healthcare company, right? And this is something we've seen across our customer base, but it's still like the same problem. It's just like maybe different types of stakeholders in the mix, but like there's still different stakeholders in the mix before, you get to the traditional sort of rep to order sort of part of the process, sort of downstream. And what we've done and built is one thing I think we like don't focus on sort of sharing enough is we really like ultimately, the software is king, right? The product is king, but how you implement that product and actually set up the customer and the client for success also matters a lot. And so one of the things we've done is made a large investment in our incredible sort of customer, we call it our customer team, which is we really only hire ex-procurement professionals and leaders, or we hire procure to pay implementation experts from KPMG, Deloitte, effectively the big four. So we have a team of roughly 30-ish folks, just over, I think. And they're really, really focused on just helping make sure that like you're really successfully set up. And so to that end, we've actually invested in best practice templates across a lot of these verticals and industries. And, because ultimately it's not, every business is different, but it's not that different, like ultimately it's just people trying to buy things from different vendors and get that spend approved from a spend perspective, but risk perspective and so forth.
So having that modular structure then that if they don't necessarily want to remove their Ariba or Coupa, whatever platform they have in situ, they can still do that and use you as the intake and orchestration layer on top of that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's exactly the intent.
Yeah. And I guess that over time, inevitably, you're growing your products and you're developing out and building a more robust platform that can cover more needs. So, do you think that something like a strategic sourcing or a contract management functionality module will be the next thing that you build on top of that? Because once you do that, one could then argue that rather than being a complementary solution, you're then a direct competitor of some of these legacy tools. And that could really then put you head to head, couldn't it?
I actually don't think about it that way because I think there's a lot of nuance in like the segment, the focus. And for us, like we look at these companies as partners and, like we're partner of SAP. We're here to actually help drive more adoption for that downstream system, right? Like that's the way we see it. Like for us, we're here to just help provide that one front door and solve that intake and orchestration layer experience before you get into the system. And so, I just look at it as like, we're just actually solving a different problem that's very closely related to, and integration points obviously matter a lot, right? If you have one of these systems, but I look at it as a very sort of fundamentally different problem.
That's an interesting answer, actually. If you see them as being collaborators rather than competitors.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I was going to ask you next, how relevant do you see SAP being in 5 years' time? And I don't just mean Ariba in that sense. I mean, their whole end-to-end ecosystem. If you look at ERP or some of the other sort of niche specific apps that they have, like Fieldglass, you see everyone's trying to snap at their feet and take business away from them. And they are an oil tanker, aren't they, a little bit in terms of change happens very slowly. They're a huge company. What do you think their position will be in this industry in 5 years from now?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm being honest, like I don't think any of these companies are going anywhere. Like I have tremendous respect for SAP and they, their products solve a really core problem. The way I sort of view it is that, the world changes and like new problems get created and new problems emerge. And then companies get started to solve those new problems. Because sometimes if it's a net new problem, it's just easier for, a small set of people to like start something and solve that problem and latch on and then grow their organization. And like, that's how, innovation happens in the world. And so I just look at us as a really small piece of all this, like in a sense, right? Like we're solving for this, intake problem and intake and orchestration problem. But fundamentally, like I actually don't, and this might be like, maybe other people say different things, but like for me, like I don't think those companies are like the system of record is not going to fundamentally change from, the ERP being SAP or being Oracle or being, one of these companies. It's going to say that. It's just the work around it and the engagement with it where I think a lot more innovation will be. So, in that sense, I don't actually expect that much change in a way in the next 5 years, which might be a controversial statement. So,
yeah, I would agree with you there. So I certainly don't think that SAP or Oracle or any of these big ERP providers are going anywhere. I'm just curious, and I think, Dr. Eliezer Epstein did a great talk on this in DPW. I just think that procurement as a function will probably not touch ERP that much. And yes, it will have to feed into it and it'll have to pull data from it and push data into it. But especially indirect procurement, direct is a little bit of a different beast, but indirect procurement, I don't really see it having much relevance going forward. I mean, yes, it will, like you say, that a business will still have to run on ERP, but yeah, the actual indirect procurement end to end, if you've got platforms like Zip, and then if you've got specialist platforms for risk management and contract management and sourcing, I don't really see a need for it.
No, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, I think like the unbundling, will continue in a sense, and that's just a macro thing, right? Like, I mean, 50 years ago, there was no Salesforce and I don't know when Cyber Systems were started, but maybe it didn't exist either. And so like even the customer record, like the source of truth for the record, the customer record and customer data was the ERP. And I think not that it isn't today, but it's just that like now it's, if you have a large business, you have a lot of customers, like you use Salesforce for that. And so like, and that's like a much more progressed sort of unbundling of a very specific use case out of the ERP. And so like philosophically, like I'm sure that will continue in some way, shape or form, but that doesn't change that, the system of record remains the system of record. I think to your point, it means that like you might interact with it less because you're actually interacting with a different layer if you're an end user or you're a procurement leader or, another sort of stakeholder in the organization. So I completely agree with you, like philosophically.
Awesome. So gazing into the crystal ball a little bit with where you are now at Zip, what would you describe as being your biggest challenge, and then also on the flip side, your biggest opportunity in terms of where you are now and your roadmap of where you want to go?
Yeah, I think for us, our company has grown a lot, but the thing that I'm excited about and to continue to do, and I think has been a challenge, but I still spend a lot of time with our customers, of course, prospects as well, but much more customers. And I'm still maintaining 30 plus sort of one-on-ones with customers every month, if not more. And just staying close to the problem and the product and getting, like I think during this call, some customer actually slacked me some feedback about a feature that they thought could be better in a certain way. And so I actually appreciate that stuff because like ultimately, that's the feedback that makes us better as a company. And so, just staying afloat of that though, as we've grown, I think has been a challenge, but something that I'm, I remain sort of very excited about. And then the opportunity ahead is, I'm just really excited for, our product team. And all of we've really, taken the sort of consumer sort of mindset to solving this problem. And so we do a tremendous amount of, user research, and, really in-depth sort of feedback sessions with our customers and like not even just our champions, but like the end users at their companies and, like real people that are actually using the product, like really understand and get to the bottom of like how we can just continue to improve and get better as a company, as a product. And so I'm really just excited for, a lot of our sort of roadmap and capabilities that will continue to evolve and ship and deliver because I'm proud of the team for the rate of change and I'm excited for what's to come.
I think that end user piece is vital. And it's always one of my beefs that center of excellence leaders are great process people and are great at making things happen. But if they've never used the system, that especially with some of this legacy tech, they don't know how bad it is to use on a day-to-day basis a lot of the time. So it's great to hear that you're actually going to the end user as well as the digital transformation champion in those businesses. Awesome. Okay, so a quick fire round here, and I'm taking inspiration from Sam Jenks from Kodiak Hub and the Way We Source podcast that do this. If you could live anywhere in the world, where would it be?
I think it'd still be San Francisco. I live in San Francisco and, I obviously work in tech and I think there's no better place to be. I know, San Francisco maybe doesn't have the best rep in the news, but I would still pick San Francisco.
Got it. And then finally, what would be your guilty pleasure of choice? And it can be anything, but you've got to keep it clean. That's the only rule.
Oh, I like eating dark chocolate. So I have after every lunch or dinner, I always have like one piece of dark chocolate. I just have a lot of dark chocolate bars. I just eat one piece. I try to limit it to one piece, which I generally succeed in. But, sometimes it's 2 or 3 or 4. To be clear, small pieces.
That's a pick-me-up though as well after lunch, isn't it, as well? Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so final question, Rujul. If someone wants to learn a little bit more about your product, where is the best place that we should send them?
Yeah, just our website, ziphq.com.
Awesome. Absolute pleasure talking to you. And it was great to actually meet with your team at DPW and see the product. So keep innovating and doing what you're doing and all the best.
Likewise. No, thank you so much for the time and for having me.
Okay, so that was Rujul with Zip talking about some of the exciting things that they've got in the pipeline and their very unique approach to developing and growing a software business coming from the consumer space. Just before we sign off, don't forget to leave us a review or like us on LinkedIn. It helps us to reach more people and get the message of the podcast out there. Until next week, take care wherever you are in the world and bye for now.